we've looked at what financial managers do, but why do they do it? What's the objective of financial management? And really, the objective is just a fancy way of saying goals. And the syllabus identifies 5 different goals: efficiency, liquidity, profitability, solvency, and growth. So it's probably a good idea. Like, I don't want to make it for you because you're not going to remember it if I tell you the way that I remember these things. But you really need to have like an acronym or something. Take the first letters of each of those and make it into a word or something like that, to make sure that you can remember what those 5 objectives are. You also need to understand what each of them are, in terms of what efficiency is and liquidity, in case you get like a short answer question or something, or a multiple choice question that has 4 of those as options, and the definition is kind of the question, and which of these is this. There's also a sixth thing, that kind of is a little bit separate from those objectives, which is understanding the conflict between short-term and long-term objectives. So a better way of putting it in the syllabus, a better way of doing it, is to split it into the short-term and the long-term goals. So liquidity and solvency, those are short-term goals because it has to do with paying off your liabilities, paying off your debts. The long-term goals, things like efficiency, profitability, and growth, are things that you're aiming for in the longer term. But in the middle there, you've got the big red box there, that shows that there is a conflict between the short-term and the long-term objectives. There are some things that you can have at the same time, and there are some things that you can't. So we're going to go into that a little bit later. So to define each of these, the first one being efficiency, which is all about increasing your sales revenue and or at the same time decreasing your expenses. Another way of saying that is to say, all right, efficiency is about increasing your sales revenue relative to your expenses, right? And you can do that by boosting your sales revenue and keeping the expenses the same if you really want. Or you can decrease your expenses and keep selling the same amount. You're still going to have that relative increase in your sales revenue compared to your expenses. Another important part, and a really often forgotten part of efficiency, is to make sure that you recover your receivables. So I've got the why you know guy, to make sure that you're recovering your receivables. Get that money that the customers owe you. Why pay me my receivables? Get that money that the customers owe you, because if you're not collecting the money from the sales, then why are you making the sales in the first place, right? So we do have a ratio, the accounts receivable turnover ratio, which measures how many days it's taking you on average to get your receivables, and that can be a really good measure of your efficiency. Are you actually getting that money? It's okay, like if you're a cash kind of business, if you're like a small supermarket or something, it's unlikely that you're going to have these receivables that go on for months and months. But if you are issuing invoices for work done, you need to be able to recover that money quickly in order to increase your sales revenue compared to your expenses, because your bills might end up being due before the customer gives you that money, right? And that's going to cause problems for the business. The second objective, liquidity, is something that people have trouble with because of that word liquid, right? The idea of liquidity is how easily your assets are turned into cash. Now, when we talk about cash, we're talking about money in the bank, not literally cash, right? Unless you're amongst our Mediterranean or Middle Eastern friends, you're probably not dealing completely in cash. You're probably dealing with money in the bank. Even if you do have like a cash register, a lot of your money is going to be in the bank. You're not just going to keep it under a mattress. So really, the goal here is to make sure that there's always cash available for the business to pay its short-term debts. But at the same time, you've got to remember that having too much cash just sitting there in the bank could mean some missed opportunities. And this is kind of the conflict between the short-term and long-term objectives. You've got to balance your short-term obligations, like paying your suppliers, paying your bills, pay the electricity bill, all that sort of stuff, your short-term things, with growth opportunities, with the longer term. You could use that money to expand. You could use that money to buy new equipment. If the money's just sitting there and you don't actually have a bill that you need to pay with that money, then you could be missing growth opportunities. So really, what you want, what you're aiming for, is a ratio of about 2 to 1. You want about twice as much money in the bank as you need to pay your short-term obligations, and too much more than that is going to really hurt your growth. If you've got 5 times as much money as you need, then you might as well take that money and do something productive with it. The third objective is profitability. This is increasing sales revenue and or decreasing your costs and your expenses. So your costs, or the cost of goods sold, those are the things directly involved in making the product. so like materials and ingredients, things like that. And your expenses are things like, other bills, and marketing expenses, things like that, which don't actually contribute to the making of the product. They're probably more to do with the selling of the product. So to be profitable, you probably need to work on both of those. You need to lower your cost of goods sold as low as possible. You need to decrease your expenses to make them as low as possible. But at the same time, you have to try to increase your sales revenue. So we look at the problem, the conflict involved in trying to do that a little bit later in the course. The fourth objective, solvency, is a little bit like liquidity, but instead of having cash available to pay your short-term debts, this is cash available to pay your longer-term debts, right? So it also involves making sure you don't get into too much debt, which would make the repayments too high, which would mean you don't have the cash available to pay your short-term or your long-term debts. So the repayments have to be sustainable. You can't be stuck paying, loans, mortgages that you can't really pay for the rest of the life of the business. Your debt levels have to be sustainable. If you are in the finance department, if you are a financial manager, you have to make sure the business doesn't get into too much debt. Look at other forms, right? Take some of the retained profits from last year, get some more shareholders, do something like that, rather than always just getting into debt, because you need to be able to service that debt in the long term and have the money to do that. The fifth and the last objective is growth. And growth is obvious, it's increasing the size of the business, and it's good because you can increase the profits and everything in the business by growing the business. There's three main ways of getting bigger. There's direct expansion, there's merging with another business, and there's acquisition, so taking over another business. Now, those are the three main ways of getting larger, of growing, but it's very important that you don't overdo it. The growth has to be sustainable. If you look up, say, AOL Time Warner, it was a merger of just three enormous companies, and it didn't work because they had too many managers, they had too many people that were accountable to too many people. No one knew who the bosses were and things like that, and it became a big mess, and it failed massively. You can't just keep growing forever. The growth has to be sustainable, right? You don't want to get too big to function. Now, the conflict between short-term and long-term objectives kind of centers around not so much efficiency. Efficiency is something that you can get pretty good at, and you can still, maintain your short-term goals of liquidity and solvency, because you can, make savings here and there. The main part of this is the conflict between liquidity and profitability, as well as solvency and profitability, and especially solvency and growth. Right? So we're going to look at each of these and an example that you could use in, say, a 2 or 3 mark short answer question, where you're asked to, explain the conflict between short-term and long-term objectives. You put in a couple of examples, and then you can get the full marks, for the question. So let's take away these ones and just look at the conflict between liquidity and profitability. If you decide that you want to focus on liquidity, you want that cash from your customers, then you might offer discounts for early payment. You might say, you know what, you have 30 days to pay this, but if you pay it in the next 7 days, we're going to give you a 10% discount. Now, that's something that businesses do frequently, because they know that, oh, look, if I have the money now, it's better than having, like, 90% of the money now is better than, even 100% of the money in 30 days. If you especially have bills that you need to pay, that can be a good strategy. But it's going to hurt your profit level for the year, because rather than, over the course of the year, you're only going to make 90%, you might only make 90 or 95% of the sales that you were going to make in terms of, dollars. So that can be a conflict. And the business needs to, say, all right, what are we aiming for here? Are we aiming for liquidity, or are we aiming for, over the year, a higher profit level? When it comes to solvency, and I guess liquidity as well, being able to pay your short-term debts and your long-term debts, you have a conflict there with profitability and with growth. Basically, if you want to grow your business and aim for higher profits in the future, you might need to sacrifice some solvency by getting a large loan. So it might look bad for the business. People might go, oh, wow, say an investor looks and goes, wow, they just got into a huge amount of debt. But if that huge amount of debt, say it was, Rio Tinto or somewhere like that, if that huge amount of debt was to, start a new mine somewhere, if it was like $5 billion to start a new mine, but over time it was going to, bring in 20-30 billion dollars. That is a good business decision, but you do have to sacrifice some solvency. You do have those extra payments that you need to pay if you do want to, aim for profitability and growth in the future. So those are some good examples that you can use in a basic question about the conflict between short-term and long-term objectives.